Good morning, everybody. We are here for another History Compass workshop. I'm so glad to be here with you today. Um, today we're going to talk a little bit about object studies and artifacts. I do want to say that I'm not going to get too deep into how artifacts are found and the relationship to archaeology and all of that, mostly because of time, because we're going to do an object study today. So I'm going to start straight off with saying, if you'd like to do an object study with me today, you should have a piece of paper, a pencil. If you have it, maybe some markers or some watercolor or crayon, something. We're going to be doing one together. I just randomly chose an artifact that we're going to be looking at. So I'm going to do that in a little bit. But before that, we're going to talk a little bit about artifacts. Now, if you want to know more about archaeology and artifacts, I'm actually doing a talk about this next weekend. So not the coming, but the following weekend at the C conference. So if you can catch me there, I think on Sunday. And we'll talk a little bit deeper about archaeology and the relationship between the two. In terms of artifacts, I really wanted to choose, when I was choosing these workshops, I wanted to choose a couple of things that I felt were often overlooked or aren't talked about enough. And so these objects are one of them. And then the next workshop will be maps, right? Which is another object, another artifact, another primary source that is often overlooked in terms of information and use, and they're really, really fun to work with. So I'll talk more about that at the end, but let's dive a little bit into artifacts. If you have any questions during this workshop, you can put them in the text box. I've got a team working with me who will send them to me so that I can answer your questions. So if you have questions about artifacts or the object studies, if you have general questions about History Compass. I answered a lot of questions in the very first Q&A that we did. So if you haven't watched that, you should go back and watch that because we go deeply into that, into the curriculum. And then we will, again, do one more in September. So artifacts are really, really important to the history, to the study of history. I think that they're important for a few reasons. The first is, of course, they give us timing, right? Chronology. They tell us when things happened because they're a primary source, right? They were made during the time that we're studying. They can help us to determine when things happened, where people were. They can help us understand relationships. So not just the relationship of people to the artifacts, but the artifacts to the time and place that we're studying. We can understand the function, how people use things, how people use their environment with these things. There's a lot of information that we glean from artifacts. I also really love looking at artifacts like archaeologists and historians do as in terms of their context, right? Artifacts are not an island unto their own, right? They exist in an ecosystem. So wherever we find an artifact, right, the context of which it was found. In fact, when archaeologists are excavating a site, they will map out the site, and it's a very meticulous, slow process because once an artifact is removed, it's no longer surrounded by the context in which it was found, right? So there are meticulous notes taken, there are drawings, there are photographs. These artifacts are documented in multiple ways in order to understand where they were found, and not just where in the place, but also what was it next to, what was it in, and that can give us information as well. They tell a story, right? Every single artifact that is found helps to tell the story, this historical narrative that we're trying to build. We're trying to get to what is the closest to truth we can. I really love that artifacts can challenge assumptions. As I point out in History Compass, they can often, sometimes, in fact, this just happened again. The example I point out in History Compass is about the 9,000-year-old female hunter burials, right? And how that sort of challenged this gender assumption that only men were hunting. And then again, it's been happening uh, there were some Viking sites, I guess, that more recent DNA analysis have shown that these warriors were women. And so there's all of these interesting assumptions that are made in the past that we are now challenging because we're re-looking at artifacts in that way. I do want to point out that when we are looking at artifacts, we are often looking at them in the context of museums, right? And that it's important to understand how that changes the artifact. So, but it also is a part of the artifact's history. So, for example, if an artifact is in a museum, there's a whole story around that as well, right? And it's part of the legacy of that time and place. It's part of the legacy of that artifact. The example I give in History Compass is about the Rosetta Stone, which is in the British Museum. It was stolen, and there are multiple organizations trying to repatriate it back to Egypt. And this is not the only artifact, and there are many, many artifacts specifically in US and European museums that are kind of undergoing this evolution of thought, right? Where people are realizing what had happened. They're understanding the history now that that history is being told. And so when we look at artifacts like that, that's also important to its story, to look at, well, where is it now and how does that change the history of that artifact? And how does it change the artifact that it's no longer in its place of origin? I think that artifacts can be really useful to your study of history. First of all, they're interesting, right? They're like really cool to look at and to find. And I think that they're relatable, especially students, I think, find that artifacts are really relatable. They're tangible, right? You can see them. You can not usually touch them, but you could usually touch some sort of reproduction artifact, which is cool. But it gives you a physical example of history. And I think that helps a lot of people. I'm a very visual learner, and so I'm very attracted to artifacts and studying through artifacts myself. First of all, it's a primary source, right? So when I look at an object, an artifact, I'm looking at it, I try to look at it objectively. I try to really analyze that. And we're going to do that today. We're going to look at a couple of objects and try to analyze them a little bit, but try to look at it objectively. Like, don't worry about where it came from or who made it or any of the questions we're going to ask. Just like focus on the object. It's a beautiful, look at its beautiful form, or its, rough form, or it's whatever. Find some adjectives, right, to describe it. What do you wonder about it? Like, really look at it, because it can tell us a lot about just itself, right? Just on its own. What do you recognize? Because a lot of the things that we find in the past, we have modern sort of equivalents. And I think it's really fun to try to find that connection, right? That connection from the past to our modern world and what we're using now. Because they're primary sources, we can analyze them in the same way we do any other primary source. And you can go through back into History Compass and see the notes that I've had around analyzing those sources. When you put that analysis together with the context, right, and the research, you can start to draw some conclusions. And what I love is that artifacts, because they exist on their own, you can start to draw your own conclusions. And I've had students look at artifacts and, decide, I'm really interested. I think this thing might have been used for, I think this thing might have been influenced by, and start to go down this road. It doesn't mean that other historians haven't thought of that or haven't written about it, but I really like it when students start to really look at their own ideas, and their own ideas have merit. Their own ideas deserve a place in the writing that they're doing and the presentations that they're doing, their work. Um, so the two things that we're going to look at in terms of artifacts, usually are use and meaning. So how was this artifact used? Um, how was it made, and how does that influence its use? Does it have meaning? And when we talk about meaning around an artifact, it doesn't have to be some big philosophical. It doesn't need to have like a spiritual use or anything like that. It can actually be like, let me think of a good artifact. Like, for example, what if we found an arrowhead? That's the first thing I thought of. And we're looking at this in terms, so let's say it's Paleolithic. So and certainly we're looking at its use, right? We have a good idea of what it might have been used for. But the meaning, we could go kind of multiple layers with this, right? The meaning of an arrowhead in a society, certainly there could be a warrior or hunting kind of class, if you will, where there was a real presence in the community around this vocation, if you will, right? This certainly survival, right? That there is an element of survival. There also might be an element of communication, or element of artistry, right? When we look at the arrowhead itself, there's all of these elements, there's all of these meanings that give it a relationship to the time and place and people that it was made by. And so that's what I mean, is that there's this meaning, there's these multiple layers of meaning that any artifact could have. And we've got to kind of dive a little bit deeper. And that's the reason that I have students do object studies, is because I want them to look a little deeper. And if you only do one, let's say in History Compass, that at least they will have that experience and they will start looking at objects differently. I will say that as I'm writing History Odyssey Ancients, there is a whole project around object studies where they are collecting artifacts into a book, and they are drawing them and deciding which ones they're going to include in their own book of objects. And the process of that makes them start to look at these objects and their relationship to this historical narrative a little bit differently, and that these artifacts are actually really building this story. So I want to, I'll pause there for a second. If there's any questions, type it in. What I'd love to do is kind of keep talking, but start to do an object study together. So when sorry about that. I'm surrounded by boxes. We just moved into our house 2 days ago. So I have History Compass here. I have this beautiful hard copy. And in Unit 1, it's Lesson 6. There's actually an entire object study here that you can use. You can kind of follow along. Now, we're going to kind of go through this process together, and that will give you a little bit of experience then in doing object studies, so that when you go back, if you haven't started History Compass already, you can go back and kind of work with it, having already done one. Now, I'm going to use an object. I just pulled a book, and we're going to choose an object out of that book. If you want to do something else, that's fine too. But I do want to use something as an example to show you kind of how an object study could look. Now, do you need to draw, because I get this question, do you actually need to draw it in order to collect objects like this? No, you could actually you could print out a copy of the image and paste it in. There's lots of ways you could do this. I don't really have any preference as to how that is achieved. I will say this though, um, drawing is actually a really important skill, and it doesn't matter how you do it, how good you think you are. You're better than you think you are. But the act of drawing itself, there's a couple of things that happens with our brain. So the first is that it kind of connects um, all the parts of our brain together. It is a precursor to writing. And so when you draw, you actually are supporting your writing. It's supporting spatial relationships, it's supporting your creativity. Like there's all these benefits to drawing. And then when you're actually drawing an artifact, you're paying attention to its shape and form. And so that's the only thing I will say about like the benefit of drawing it is there's these other benefits that you get with it. So I do want to point that out. However, if you have a student who is completely reluctant, does not want to do it, that's not necessarily the hill I would die on. Just print out a picture of it. So I'm going to actually change my camera real quick because I did, in fact, if you were with me last time, I was hoping to find my other camera so that I could show you what I was doing with my other camera, and I did find it. So I'm going to change my camera real quick. Aha, there we go. And I am using the new edition of, this is brand new. In fact, this was sent to me pre-publication so that I begged and pleaded for an advance copy. So this is the new Smithsonian History Encyclopedia. It's really beautiful. So far, there hasn't been much change from the old version, but I am using this as the spine for History Odyssey. So I wanted to pull this and show you. I just grabbed an artifact that I felt was easy to draw and fun and interesting. There were so many options that I could, and if we decide that we want to do a second one today, we'll just flip through and grab another one. But today I wanted to do this jar right here. So when I approach an object study, it's really awesome if you can do them in person, right? But is that possible for everybody? Absolutely not. In fact, for everybody, there's going to be some artifacts we don't have access to. Thank goodness that so many collections are online. And I really appreciate that because you are able to get like high quality videos and photographs of artifacts at this point. And I will say that while I don't necessarily love that we had a pandemic, one of the silver linings was in fact that museums really made an effort to make their collections more accessible. And that meant that anybody can, kind of go on into their websites and see a lot of what they have. And that's, again, just, I feel like that's a silver lining that we got from what was a really horrible time. So, do you have access to this particular jar? Well, only if you are in the UK or visit the UK. This jar is actually at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. So I did a little research on where it was before this, just so I could tell you where it was. And these, I don't know very many people who do not like octopus. It's just a beautiful, beautiful vase. So we're gonna focus on this one today. I'm gonna see if I can pull this down just a little bit here. There, I think you can see it a little bit better. And we're going to look at this for a second because when you're looking at an artifact, I just want you to look at, well, what does it look like? Well, first of all, this form, right? The way in which this is shaped is actually really, really familiar. It's a classic, timeless shape that jars and vases have been made in. They were made in this form before the Minoans, and they were made long after. So what are we talking about? We're actually talking about this Bronze Age culture. It's on the island of Crete mostly, in what is now Greece. And there's a long history of pottery here. In fact, if you study Grecian pottery, that takes you for thousands and thousands of years. There's an evolution of pottery that happens, and different styles, different shapes, different techniques, right? And you can often tell where it came from and when it was made just by how it looks. There's an entire subset of art historians who study only this subject because it's so robust. The other cool thing about an artifact like this is that there are a lot of them, because the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, and the Greeks after them used pottery in their daily life. Like it wasn't special in the sense that it was only reserved for some people. It was actually, used every single day for oils and water and foods, and so we actually have a good amount of pottery. And that means that it's telling a story in a very robust way, right? We can actually kind of determine what's going on in society, what their relationship were to these jars. We can find the residue of food in these jars and find out what they were eating. Like there's all of these cool things from just this artifact. So when we look at it, when we start with this form, right? What do I look at? What do I see? I see the shape. I see that there's this octopus with these beautiful tentacles here, and then this sort of abstract form. And so you start off by wondering, like, okay, well, what do I wonder about this particular artifact? I can tell that it's made by some sort of clay or and some sort of pigment. I maybe don't know what it's made of, what those things are made of yet. I might notice these details, like not just the octopus, but these like abstract kind of sea marine life pieces here. What purpose does it serve? Now I'm going to go through this list. What purpose does it serve? Well, my guess is to store things, right? I know what these are made of, but if I were looking at this for the first time and didn't know anything about it, I do know that jars are used to store things, so I could make an educated guess there, right? Is it functional, aesthetic, or both? Well, my experience tells me that it could be both. But depending on what you're looking at, you might make a guess there. What's the object's condition? So the condition of this vase is actually very, very good. And so I just want to note that we're able to decipher so much of it because it's in such good condition. And then the last two questions are, how does the object make you feel? And what more do you want to know about the object? So when I look at this, the object makes me feel curious, and it also makes me feel a little delighted. And I want to note that because the octopus is just like amazing and so adorable. But also, I think that when we're studying history, we're so focused on like, what are we learning and the research and the output, right? What are we going to do with that information, that we don't stop and be delighted for a little bit. Like, this is cool. It's so, like, the aesthetics of it to me are just absolutely adorable. Really, really beautiful. I love that it's kind of this mixture of a noticeable animal, but also sort of abstract in its design. It's very, very cool. And I just want to stop and note that. Like, it's awesome. And I'm sure that there are other artifacts that do that for me too. And so, like, I was just noticing, I was researching more modern maps for another project, and I found this watch that it's basically a watch band, and it has this little scroll, and it has a map on it that you scroll. And in fact, I will grab a picture of it and show it to you in our next workshop because it's absolutely the coolest thing ever. And I think it's really important to be delighted by some of the things we find, and to think about what the people who made it must have been doing, must have been thinking when they made it. And so its function, did it delight its maker as much as it did me? So that kind of completes that first, like, focus on the object. What are you actually seeing? What are you noticing? Because if you dive straight into the research of it, you're going to miss all these details. Like if you were seeing this one in person, which I have, you might notice where the chips are, right? Or you might, and again, you could probably find a better photo than this, but I am I'm working in a limited workshop at the moment. You might notice where it's rubbed and faded. It happens to be more faded. There's these little handles. You can't see them very well right here, but there's these little handles there where people were using those, and the pigment would have faded a little bit, right? Those little details are really important to notice. And I think maybe at the most fundamental level, because you're focusing so much and noticing so much, you develop a relationship with this object, right? And you feel connected to it. I think that's important. So now we're going to look at it a little bit closer in terms of like, well, what are we going to do here? So the first thing that I like to do, let me see if I can get a better, there we go. Now, I guess maybe for a few minutes, we're going to do a little bit of a drawing tutorial here, because I know that one of the intimidating parts of doing an object study or doing any drawing actually for any student is that they are afraid they're not going to do it right, that it won't look good. And that goes down to like fundamentals of drawing. When I'm teaching a class, I often, in fact, I've taught object studies and I've taught art classes, and we focus on shape. So if there's any advice that I can give you about doing object studies and drawing it, it's that you want to focus on the shape. So do you notice here how there's this sort of egg shape here? So I would focus on that. I would go ahead and just lightly sketch an egg shape. And then do you see how there's like this cylinder down here? Does it have to be perfect? Absolutely not. Don't worry about that. And then how it comes down. And then up here, it's sort of a cylinder that comes out. So the bottom is going to be shorter than the top. So we're going to do another cylinder up here. Just sketch it out. Don't worry about being perfect. So again, we've got kind of this basic shape. Did you see how we took 3 shapes, put them together, and now we've got what is pretty close now to what the object looks like. So I might start sketching that out now and joining those shapes together. You can kind of pull those shapes together like that and come down. Again, don't worry about it. Now remember, the bottom is not going to be a straight line. It's going to be kind of curved because this is not a 2-dimensional object. It's a 3-dimensional object. So we're going to curve it here. We're just going to do a really quick sketch here. I'm not even going to worry about touching up. And your students can spend as much time as they want on this. Like I would not put any sort of time limit on it. I would let them get it to the place that they want it to be. Then I might look at the details. So I'm just going to move on because I have a time constraint here. Is, where are the details? So there's a wave here. There's a wave here. There's kind of this circle here. I might put the octopus. Let's do the octopus first. So again, it's about shapes. There's kind of this circle here, and then a circle here, and then it kind of comes out. So I'm going to join those now. And then one of his tentacles comes up. One of them comes up and around. Did I go the wrong way? I absolutely went the wrong way. That's fine. Well, I'm going to paint over this so it doesn't matter. So it went this way, and then it went this way. This way. This way. That way. And that way. So I've got a basic octopus there. Now, at this point, I might go in and do more details, which we can come back to, but I do want to get to the information. So what do we know about this? Let me make sure you can still see the object if you're still drawing it. So what do we know about this object? Well, we know that this is called, if we were to do research, we would know that this is called the Knossos storage jug. And it was found in Knossos, Crete. It is a late Minoan. And the estimated date is 1450 to 1400 BCE. So let's look at the object study questions that we have. We have the name of the object, where it was found, and where it's located now. Well, it's currently at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, England. Where and when was it found? It was found in Knossos, and it was found by Sir Arthur Evans, who was a famous, we'll call him a hobbyist archaeologist. There's a whole, I could do a whole workshop on what the evolution of archaeology, obviously much, much different today than it was in the 19th and 18th and 19th centuries, and even the early 20th century. So it was excavated, but then it was presented. So this is important information. It was presented by the government of Crete in 1911 to the Ashmolean, who Sir Arthur Evans was I think he was like the chairman or something during this time. So that makes sense, right, that there would be this relationship. So it was not taken by him. It was presented by the Cretan government, although it would be interesting to dive deeply, because this is the way I like to think is like, well, what was the circumstances, right? What was the context behind that? I have not done that research. But I'm going to put a little star there because I'm actually really interested in looking in that further. Um, it's important to note what its actual details are. So it is 75 centimeters high and 54 centimeters in diameter. So that comes out to about almost 30 inches in height. That's a pretty good sized vessel. I'm going to skip the object important to human history because we're going to talk about that last. What is the object made of? Well, the object's made of clay. Oftentimes, these vessels were painted with pigment on wet plaster. There's a really interesting area of research around the pigments. So pigments would have been derived by the surrounding land, or they might have been imported, but they were natural pigments. And there's a whole geology and art trail that you could go down if you have a student who's really interested in that. In what ways you could think you could use this object for research? We're going to skip that. We did the date. Is there anything else that's important to know about this object? Well, I think it's important to know that this kind of object depicts marine life, and that we learn a lot about the relationship between the people and the ocean that they live next to. The imagery, like octopus and fish and dolphins, like this is a really abundant and popular image that's coming up. What's cool is that this is kind of a blend of Minoan and Mycenaean. So you can kind of see that this object represents the transition between the two. It has this very popular Minoan motif of marine life, but it's all the imagery around it is very abstract, which is a little bit more Mycenaean. So you can see a blending of cultures. So that is really important. Blending of cultures to note is that it's transitional. Like that's a really important thing to know. It tells us a lot about, so yeah, let's get into that. It tells us a lot about the relationship to sea life, the daily life, right? Well, I told you that these vessels are used really commonly. So we can find out like what they were eating, what they were using them for by testing the insides or what's depicted on them, the aesthetics of them, right? We could find out a little bit more about how society was thinking a little bit more philosophically. We could learn about trade and migration. There are lots of things we could actually learn about this. So then the big question that I skipped over that we're going to come back to is like, why would this be important to the study of history? Well, one, it tells us all of these things, right? I just named at least a dozen things that we could kind of go down and study to tell us more about this particular culture and this particular time and place. But it also it's within the context, right? It's part of a larger context, not only of the story that pottery tells in this region, but also how does it relate to pottery from around the world? What can we learn from comparing and contrasting, right? There is, pottery has played an enormous role in human history and has given us lots of information. So its importance is noted, and it's one area that I think is really fun to study because it gives us so much. So we have all of this information, and I just want to show you this really quick. So this is the object study page. You have the material list and you have the procedure here. I want to point out that all of this information here, right, that you are writing down, it's awesome to collect it. I think it's really interesting on its own, but it is a catalyst to help students with their study. They will not only learn more about the cultures and the times and places that they're studying, but it also can give them a stepping stone towards research assignments and other assignments that they're going to be doing. And I want to point this out because if they have an object that they're really, really just loving, they can use that to decide when they have the option to create their own assignment or their own research project. For example, later on in this curriculum, they can use this as a jumping point. So they could use the object itself for sure, but they could also, like when I said I'm very interested in this transitional period, they could, if they were very interested also in this transitional period, that could be the thing that they write their long essay about. Or if they were interested in why the government of Crete would have presented the Ashmolean Museum with this jar, like that could be the thing that they do their short essay on, for example. So I just want to point out that these object studies they don't exist on their own, that they are in fact meant to also inspire, right, and provide a stepping stone to further research and ideas for projects, especially when they can't think of anything, right? They can go back to this and something that they really loved. So if we want to finish this space out, we might go over it with a darker line. I want to make sure I get these awesome eyes. So I'm going to just highlight those. So, and then you could go, because the other thing that I managed to find in my boxes are my paintbrushes. So maybe we want to, I'm going to wrap up here in just a few minutes. So maybe we want to go ahead and color this in, right? And they could do an entire, this is not a great brush, sorry. Hold on just a second. There we go. So maybe they want to have it in full color, in which case they can do that. So I will say that if you are going to use watercolors, you want to start with the lightest colors first, not like I just did. And the trick to making objects look old is to layer the colors and then use darker, like browns or rust tones in the places where dust would have collected, right? And to use a dry brush, one that's not wet, to sort of create that sort of old look. So those are my tips. And if you have more art questions, you can feel free to let me know. But they can paint these in and create their own little book. One of my favorite things to do when I'm teaching in person in a classroom is to create a museum wall of these objects that the students are making. I think that putting them on display gives them extra importance, and it encourages, many of you will probably be familiar with the term strewing, which means, for those of you who aren't familiar with this term, it means to kind of just place in front of, to provoke thought and conversation. And I use strewing a lot in not only visually, like putting stuff out, but also in discussions. I'll strew an idea and see if anybody picks it up. So when you display these, I think that it is a form of strewing in that they pass by them and they start thinking a little bit more carefully. They might wonder things that might provoke more research. There's all sorts of things that can happen because they're displayed. The other thing that you can do as the educator is to strew objects that they might want to do object studies on, right? You might want to strew some pictures, or if you manage to have or get your hands on some reproduction kind of items. If you want to go to the museum and point out things, or one of my favorite things to do in museums with students is to do a treasure hunt, where I've kind of thought of some things that I think they might be interested in, and we do a treasure hunt where they have to find them. And I don't just say find them. I usually build in, especially with older students, I will build in something that they need to look at and notice. So it's not just find the Minoan jar with the octopus. It will be, find the Minoan jar with the octopus and note the design directly above its head. It makes them look at the object a little bit differently. I think if you just tell them to go find it, they're just going to go find it. So I try to build in a little bit more. Just checking here. So I'm not going to dive too deeply into the painting unless anybody has any questions about it. But you get the idea, is that you're really looking at it. You're really able to create a catalog of the object that they're interested in. You are taking notes on all of these things that they've been asked and collecting them. Again, in History Compass, they're just doing one, but in further curriculum, they're going to be creating an entire book of them. And so I think this is one, really good practice, but two, they might want to start thinking about how do they determine which objects are important? Which ones are they choosing in terms of not just its place in history, but like their personal interest, right? Because history, yes, is important to understand as global citizens and as humans. It's our story, but their own connection to it, right? What do they love? What are they delighted by is just as important. And so this is kind of gets them started on the road. And again, it's a really physical, tangible way in which to study history. And I think really interesting. So this is the general layout of how we could keep going in terms of notes. Some students will only write half of this. Some of them will write a full page. Again, I think that you start with where they're at and then start building up. So maybe they start with only half of this, and then you start asking questions and saying, oh, we should write that down. And then again, if they get to a point where they're doing a research assignment and they don't know what to write about, you can always say, well, let's go back to these. Was there anything interesting in there that you might want to do? So at this, I want to wrap up because I'm running out of time here. Are there any questions about object studies or artifacts, building these out? Any questions about History Compass? I'll give it just a second because I know that there's a delay between this stream and the Facebook Live. There's I think she said 20-second or 15-second delay. So I'll give it a second here. I do want to point out that next time we will be looking at maps, and if you would like, I will stay on a bit longer so that we can actually draw out a whole map together. If that's interesting, please leave a comment and let me know if that's interesting. We were just going to do a basic kind of guideline, but I'm happy to spend more time on that as well. I think maps, I have heard the feedback that maps seem to be the most intimidating. So I want to make sure I make it a little easier and simple for you. Again, that's at the beginning of September. And then next weekend, I'm speaking at the C conference. I think there's 2 sessions. The first is I'm going to be talking about History Compass a little bit. But the primary workshop I'm doing there is on archaeology and artifacts and the relationship between those two, and how we can kind of work with both of those, right? The process of and the outcome of, in order to understand and study history a little bit better. And also the relationship that we have to archaeology in terms of our communities and our society, because there's pieces of archaeology that are, I think, sort of hidden from the public, but they play a fundamental role in how communities are built, and how they are allowed to grow or not. So I hope you will join me for that. Let me see. One question. Can you use everyday objects? Can you use every objects in your house or ancient famous pieces? You can use anything. Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, if you want a really low pressure way to start an object study, just choose something in your house, because that feels very low pressure, I think, to students. And I also want to point out that there's a project in History Compass that goes over multiple lessons, right? It's the history of the object. And when we do the history of the object, I'm telling you, I have had everything from cellos to rubber bands. And I'm telling you, the rubber band one was one of the most interesting history of an object projects I've ever seen. The history of rubber bands is fascinating. So can you imagine, one, that'd be a really fun and easy object study to do in terms of drawing, like low pressure, right? Draw a rubber band. But also it's so accessible, right? It's something you see every day. It feels very, very low stakes. And then when you dive into it, it's absolutely fascinating. And so I would actually, yes, be super happy to start with just everyday objects around the house. And I think that you'd be surprised at how much it relates to history. For example, because I don't ask my students to do anything that I wouldn't be willing to do, I did object studies as well. And I chose a wax seal. And when I dove into the history of them, they went back to the ancient Middle East. So like it was I did not realize it was that lengthy of a history. So something that I use very regularly, and I realize not everybody uses wax seals, but I use them on all my letters. In fact, I still handwrite letters, and I know that that's a rarity, but I have a few people I write to in that way, and something I use every day, like, connects me to thousands of years ago. I just think that's the coolest. So yes, you can absolutely use everyday objects. You don't need to use anything. And also, as you study more and more modern history, right, you will be using everyday objects because they're going to connect. They're things that are still used. They're still around. Any other questions? I'll give it a second because, again, that delay. Well, I am so thrilled that we could get together today and kind of go over this object study. It's one of my favorite projects, and so I was really happy to share it with you. And again, it's just going to be something that's going to show up again and again in the curriculum that I'm writing. I think it's a really important use of time, and so I'm hoping that your students really enjoy it. And that they get as much out of it as I do. And even as a historian, like when I go into museums, I'm particularly fascinated by certain things. I will sit down, I have a notebook, and I will sit down and do an object study. So it's an active, and I know other historians who do the same. And so it's an active part of history. And it's I think it's really fun. So, and then again, in terms of its connection to what you're doing, I think it's a really tangible way of creating that relationship. So, if there are no other questions, I'm going to say goodbye for now. I hope to see you in September, where we are going to take a little bit more time, I think, because one, I want to go over maps. I'll probably have some slides and dive a little bit deeper into maps. But then I've heard that that some of you really, really want a session on actually making the maps, and so I'm happy to do that. And then I hope to see many of you next weekend at the C conference. If you have any other questions that were not addressed in this workshop and you'd like me to cover them next time, or you'd like me to answer them online, just go ahead and write them into the event page in the discussion posts, and I will go in and answer that. If you could tag me, that would be great. Just make sure that I see them. And then otherwise, I will see you next time. Thank you.